My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 31 years old, a marketing analyst living in Chicago, and the second-born daughter in a family that only ever seemed to have room for one star, my sister, Hannah. Growing up, I learned early that in my parents' eyes, she was the golden one, the child who could do no wrong, the one who always got the loudest applause at the dinner table. And me? I was the shadow, present, but never really seen. If you're watching this, please hit the like button, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know, and sharing your own experiences helps remind people like me that we're not alone. From the time we were kids, the differences were obvious. Hannah brought home a B+ in math once, and my mother rushed to reassure her that not everyone is good with numbers. When I brought home an A in the same subject, my father barely looked up from his newspaper before asking why it wasn't an A+. On Christmas mornings, Hannah's gifts were always wrapped in shiny paper and stacked high like a tower, while mine were tucked in a corner, smaller, simpler, as if they were afterthoughts. The praise flowed toward her like water, steady and unquestioned, while I learned to live on scraps of acknowledgement. A pat on the shoulder here, a distracted good job there. My sister thrived in the spotlight, and I taught myself how to survive in the dark. But even as adults, the pattern never changed. At family gatherings, conversations bent themselves around Hannah's job promotions, her vacations, her new apartment. When I mentioned landing a major client at work, my father cut me off to ask Hannah about her weekend yoga retreat. It didn't matter how much I achieved. It was always Hannah's name that lit up the room. The night it all finally broke open wasn't just about one dinner or one slight. It was the weight of years pressing down, the unspoken rule that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be enough in their eyes. That night, for the first time, I decided I wasn't going to quietly accept my role as the forgotten daughter anymore. Because here's the thing about being ignored for so long. It teaches you to listen closely, and I had been listening, to the way my parents twisted fairness into favoritism, to the way my sister basked in their approval, to the way I disappeared in my own family story. I had been listening long enough to know exactly how to change the script, and this time, I wasn't going to fade quietly into the background. I wish I could tell you that being sidelined at family gatherings was unusual, but the truth is, it was as predictable as the seasons. My parents had been writing that script since I was a child, and no matter how hard I tried to improvise, the ending was always the same. My sister Claire had been their golden girl from the very beginning. She wasn't just praised, she was worshipped. Straight A's, she was brilliant. A leading role in the school play, our shining star. Meanwhile, if I earned an A- in math, I was scolded for not applying myself. If I took on a part-time job, it was treated like a distraction instead of initiative. Claire could stumble, and they'd still call it grace. I could soar, and they'd still call it luck. It wasn't one single act that made me feel invisible. It was the collection of small, cutting moments that built up year after year. A missed graduation photo because they were busy adjusting Claire's cap. A Christmas morning where her gifts stretched halfway across the living room while mine could fit into a shoebox. A family dinner where I was asked to take the group photo so they could all smile together without me in the frame. At 8 years old, I didn't have words for it. I just felt the sting of being guided out of pictures, of being told to be patient when my turn never came. By the time I was a teenager, I had convinced myself it was my fault. Maybe I wasn't funny enough, or loud enough, or worth the spotlight. Maybe Claire really was the better child, and I just needed to accept it. The hardest part wasn't even their treatment. It was the silence of everyone else. My aunts and cousins would notice, their eyes soft with pity, but no one ever said anything. No one ever challenged my parents. I lived in that strange in-between space, seen, but not defended. When I finally left for college, I told myself that distance would fix it. I built my own life piece by piece, studying late nights, taking internships, moving into my first apartment. I worked harder than I should have, always trying to prove to myself what they refused to acknowledge, and in time, I succeeded. My career grew, my finances stabilized, and eventually I bought something that felt completely mine, A mountain cabin, quiet and snow-draped, far from their reach. It should have been enough. But every December reminded me that no amount of success erased the child inside me still waiting for a seat at their table. Last year was the breaking point. I had been invited, in the loosest sense of the word. Yet the night itself was cold, the conversation looping around memories that had nothing to do with me. Claire's career, Claire's engagement, Claire's every milestone replayed like a highlight reel. My contribution? Passing the dishes. At one point, my mother asked me to take the group photo so that everyone could be in it. Everyone but me. So when the message came this year, the one about keeping things just immediate family, I didn't feel shock. I didn't even cry. It was like hearing the final line in a story I had already memorized. My name had been erased before it was even considered. And yet, something shifted. It didn't just hurt, it liberated me. If I was never going to be chosen, then I could stop auditioning. I didn't have to keep trying to fit myself into their script. I could write my own story, one where I wasn't the afterthought, but the center. That was the seed of the plan, a thought so simple, yet so powerful. If they won't make a place for me, then I'll make my own table. A table big enough, warm enough, unforgettable enough that no one would mistake me for the forgotten daughter ever again. And as December crept forward, that seed grew into something far bigger than they could have ever imagined. In the days after my parents' message, I forced myself to keep my routine on the surface. I worked, I answered calls, I showed up where I was expected to. But underneath, my mind kept circling the same thought. If they wouldn't give me a place at their table, I would build one they could never touch. At first, the idea felt too wild to entertain. Could I really host something of my own? Could I turn a holiday that had always been theirs into mine? The more I sat with it, the clearer it became. I had the space, I had the means, and most importantly, I had the will. I thought about my cabin in the mountains, the place I had always considered my retreat. When I first bought it, I pictured quiet weekends, maybe a small group of friends around the fireplace. But now I saw it in a different light. Not as a refuge, but as a stage. A stage where I could reclaim what I had been denied for so long. The first step was deciding who to invite. Not everyone, only those who mattered to me, those who had seen me, even in small ways, when my parents refused. My Aunt Lydia, who never forgot my birthday. My cousin Daniel, who once drove 3 hours just to help me move apartments. My Uncle Robert, who had a way of making me feel like I belonged, even when my parents made me question it. I started with Lydia. I called her one evening after work, keeping my voice steady but letting the excitement thread through. I told her I was planning a mountain Christmas, the kind you see on postcards, snow-covered pines, glowing windows, firelight spilling across the floor. I promised her she wouldn't have to worry about a thing. Her reaction was instant. She laughed, then cried, saying she hadn't been to the mountains since she was a teenager. She said it sounded magical. That was my first yes. After that, the invitations rolled out one by one. Each call carried the same lightness. No mention of my parents, no mention of being left out. Just an open door, a warm place to gather, everything taken care of. Daniel's answer came before I had finished describing the cabin. Robert chuckled, saying it sounded a hell of a lot better than another predictable dinner in the city. Within a week, my guest list had grown to more than a dozen. Each confirmation filled me with something I hadn't felt in years, not just relief, but power. For once, I wasn't waiting for scraps of approval. I was creating something entirely my own. But the success of the plan rested on one crucial element: secrecy. My parents couldn't know. Not until it was too late to spin it into their story, not until the silence at their table made its own statement. That meant no social media posts, no casual mentions, no leaks. I kept the calls short, practical, and reminded everyone that this was just between us until the day arrived. Still, the weight of that secrecy pressed on me. At night, I lay awake picturing the exact moment my parents would realize. Would it be when they glanced at the empty chairs around their table? When no one showed up for dessert? Or when a cousin accidentally posted a snowy photo from my balcony? The risk was real, but so was the pull of seeing it through. As the date drew closer, I poured myself into preparations. I booked a private chef for the meals, ordered handcrafted ornaments for the trees, and arranged for sleigh rides through the mountain trails. I wanted every detail perfect, not out of vanity, but because this wasn't just about revenge. It was about creating a memory worth holding on to, a holiday that felt like it belonged to me at last. And yet, beneath all the lists and plans, a quieter truth lingered. For all my determination, a small part of me still wished for something simpler, a phone call, an acknowledgement, some sign that they cared. But that call never came. And maybe that was the point. This year, I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I was choosing for myself. The days that followed were a blur of ordinary routines laced with extraordinary anticipation. On the surface, I went about my life as if nothing had changed, logging into meetings, answering emails, folding laundry in the quiet of my apartment. But beneath the surface, my mind pulsed with a steady current of planning. Every decision, every checklist, every whispered call was another step towards something I had never dared to imagine before, a Christmas of my own making. The guest list had already begun to take shape. Sarah had been the first to say yes, her voice thick with emotion over the phone, as though the invitation itself had lifted a weight she'd carried quietly for years. Mark had been quick to follow, his enthusiasm infectious, promising to bring his camera to capture every moment in the mountains. Uncle James's acceptance had come with that low, steady warmth he carried in everything he did, a kind of reassurance that reminded me I wasn't crazy for doing this. By the end of that week, the confirmations kept stacking like dominoes, each one falling into place with ease I hadn't expected. Aunts, cousins, even a few family friends who had once drifted quietly toward my parents' orbit now leaned toward me with gratitude. Each yes was a small act of defiance against the hierarchy my parents had built for so long, though I never said that out loud. I presented the invitation as generosity, as spontaneity, but inside I knew it was something more. Still, secrecy was everything. If my parents caught wind of it too soon, they would find a way to poison the well. They had always been masters at controlling narratives, twisting intentions until generosity looked like manipulation, until independence looked like betrayal. I couldn't give them that chance, so I kept the preparations quiet, tucking receipts into folders they would never see, forwarding confirmation emails to a private address, and reminding every guest that discretion was part of the magic. "It's a surprise," I would say, lightly, though what I really meant was, let them discover the silence when it's too late to stop it. The logistics became my obsession. Flights staggered so arrivals would feel like a cascade of joy rather than a trickle. A shuttle scheduled to bring everyone directly from the airport to the lodge, sparing them the hassle of icy roads. Menus drafted with the chef, built like a story that unfolded over 3 nights, cozy, traditional, and finally, lavish. I ordered ornaments from artisans in small mountain towns, each one unique, as if to say this Christmas would never be replicated. At night, though, when the rush of tasks settled into stillness, doubt sometimes crept in. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had gone too far. Was this truly about joy, or was it about making a point? The answer, I suspected, was both. For every vision of my cousins laughing over cocoa, there was another vision. My parents sitting in their dining room, glancing at the empty chairs, confusion shading into realization. I didn't pretend I didn't want that image. And yet, I told myself, wasn't that what balance looked like? For years, I had absorbed their decisions in silence. Every overlooked invitation, every forgotten call, every seat I was gently nudged out of had accumulated until it shaped me into someone who believed invisibility was inevitable. Now I wasn't erasing them, I was erasing their control. By mid-December, the weather seemed to join the conspiracy. Denver was wrapped in early storms, snow thickening on sidewalks and rooftops, as though the world itself was preparing a stage. I drove to Aspen one afternoon, the highway winding through mountains heavy with powder, the sky bruised with clouds that threatened more. When I stepped into the lodge, the air smelled faintly of cedar and stone, the kind of scent that rooted itself deep in memory. I walked from room to room, checking lists, picturing faces. The great room with its vaulted ceiling would echo with laughter. The dining table, already polished to a gleam, would hold feasts unlike anything I had known as a child. The bedrooms, each warmed with quilts and baskets, would cradle the people who had chosen me, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. Standing by the window, I looked out at the snow drifting down, the world beyond wrapped in white. For the first time, the lodge didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a declaration. That night, as I locked up and prepared to leave, I carried with me not just the weight of secrecy, but the strange thrill of defiance. Because this year, the silence at my parents' table would no longer be mine to bear. The days edged closer to Christmas, and with each sunrise, the weight of anticipation pressed heavier against my chest. It wasn't just the planning anymore. It was the knowledge that the plans were moving from ideas to inevitabilities. Flights were confirmed, snow was falling thick across the Rockies, and the lodge in Aspen was no longer an empty retreat. It was becoming a vessel for something larger than I had ever dared to create. The more I prepared, the more I couldn't help but imagine what my parents' house looked like at the same time. I pictured my mother arranging menus with her perfectionist's touch, polishing silver that had been in the family for generations, rehearsing small speeches about family tradition. I pictured my father pouring wine in the evenings, checking over lists she had already checked twice, both of them certain that the gravitational pull of their house was still as strong as it had always been. But in truth, it wasn't. The center was shifting, quietly, relentlessly. The lodge in Aspen glowed brighter with each detail I added. The florist delivered garlands thick with pine cones, their scent filling the great room until it felt like the mountains themselves had seeped inside. The chef sent me updates on deliveries, crates of lobster, bottles of champagne, spices that smelled of warmth and luxury. I checked over every room as if I were preparing for royalty. Quilts smoothed, pillows plumped, bedside tables topped with little welcome baskets. And yet, in the quiet hours, doubt returned like a shadow. I would find myself standing in the great room long after midnight, the fire dying low, asking questions I couldn't fully answer. Was I creating joy? Or was I orchestrating absence? Was this really about family? Or was it about revenge? The truth was that it was both. For every tender moment of anticipation, Sarah's excitement, Mark's gratitude, the warmth in James's voice, there was another image, sharper, colder. My parents sitting down to a table half empty. My brother glancing around, confused. His fiancée whispering questions in his ear. The harpist playing softly in a room filled with silence. I could see it all, and a part of me wanted it. Needed it. But the strangest thing was how natural it felt. For years, I had been on the receiving end of carefully orchestrated exclusions, each one disguised as practicality or oversight. This time, the roles were reversed. And while I told myself it wasn't the same, because my lodge was built on invitations, not omissions, the satisfaction of that reversal was undeniable. Denver in December pulsed with its own energy. Storefronts glowed with twinkle lights, coffee shops spilled cinnamon into the streets, strangers nodded with holiday patience. I moved through it like a ghost, my errands carrying me from boutiques to florists to markets, but always with my mind elsewhere. I wasn't just buying supplies, I was building a world, one they could not touch. By mid-month, my phone was a constant stream of messages from relatives confirming their excitement, a cousin asking if snowshoes would be needed, an aunt sending me a picture of her packed suitcase. Every notification brought a little rush of warmth, a reminder that this wasn't just an act of rebellion. It was an act of connection. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone to make a place for me. I was making one for others. Still, secrecy was fragile. I lived in quiet fear that one careless comment, one stray social media post, would unravel it all. At night, I would scroll through my feed with a tight stomach, half expecting to see a cousin posting about the trip, tagging me by accident. But no, everyone seemed to understand the importance. The silence was its own kind of loyalty. The snowstorm that blanketed Denver 1 week before Christmas felt like a blessing. Flights were delayed across the country, roads slick with ice. But for me, it only heightened the sense of inevitability. The world itself seemed to be slowing, preparing for something significant. I drove to Aspen again that week. The mountains looming like watchful guardians, the highway cutting through walls of snow. When I arrived, the lodge took my breath away all over again. The garlands had been hung, the great tree in the main room stood 12 feet tall, its ornaments shimmering in the firelight. The chef had already stocked the pantry with scents of rosemary, garlic, and cinnamon. I walked through it in silence, my footsteps echoing softly against the polished wood floors. It felt alive. But the more alive it felt, the more aware I became of the silence elsewhere. I knew what was happening in my parents' house, even without being there. The rehearsed traditions, the perfectly staged dinner, the illusion of family closeness. What they didn't know yet, what they couldn't know yet, was that the illusion was about to collapse. Standing at the window that night, watching snow fall across the mountains, I realized the truth. This wasn't just about Christmas. It wasn't about one dinner, one holiday, or even one family feud. It was about shifting gravity, about refusing to orbit a sun that had burned me too many times. The lodge wasn't just a house, it was proof. Proof that I could build warmth where none had been offered. Proof that the family story could bend away from the script my parents had written. Proof that I had a place, even if I had to carve it out myself. And somewhere, deep in that snowy silence, I knew. Once this Christmas came and went, nothing in our family would ever return to the way it had been. The week before Christmas felt stretched thin, as if each day carried the weight of 100 unspoken truths. Everything on the surface was in order. The chef had confirmed the final menu, the florist had delivered the last arrangements, and the lodge glowed in the evening light like something out of a snow globe. On paper, it was perfect. But perfection is fragile, and I felt it pressing against me with every hour that passed. The secrecy was the hardest part. My relatives had done their part beautifully. No social media posts, no casual comments in group chats, no slip-ups in conversations that could trickle back to my parents. And yet, I lived with the constant dread that the curtain would lift too early. One photo shared online, one cousin letting something slip in a moment of excitement, and the entire plan could crumble. I became hyper-aware of every vibration of my phone. Each new notification carried a surge of adrenaline. Was it a cousin confirming arrival? Or was it my mother, piecing together the silence, demanding to know what I was hiding? More often than not, it was harmless. A question about snow boots, a request for flight details. But each message reminded me that time was moving, that discovery was coming whether I was ready or not. At night, when the house in Denver fell quiet, I would lie awake replaying all the ways this could go wrong. What if the weather trapped everyone in airports, leaving me in Aspen with a half-decorated lodge and no one to fill it? What if my parents somehow intercepted the plan and poisoned the well, convincing the family that my invitation was manipulative? Or worse, what if no one came at all, leaving me sitting in a hollow house, surrounded by the very emptiness I had tried to escape? Still, the momentum was unstoppable. Each confirmation had been like a domino, and by now the line had already tipped. Flights were booked, rooms assigned, welcome baskets prepared. This wasn't just an idea anymore, it was reality, walking toward me in boots crunching across snow. And yet, beneath the anticipation, there was something sharper, a restless edge I couldn't quite file down, because I knew what was happening in my parents' house at the same time. My mother, orchestrating traditions with military precision. My father, smiling politely as though nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. My brother Michael, the golden son, slipping into his role without hesitation, laughing with relatives who would soon be absent from their table. Did they sense it already? Did they feel the pull shifting? Or did they still believe that everything would unfold as it always had? I imagined my mother counting chairs at her long dining table, laying out cutlery in neat, rigid lines, never considering that half those seats would remain empty. That image brought a rush of satisfaction, but it also unsettled me. Revenge and joy are dangerous twins. Sometimes it's hard to tell one from the other. I told myself this wasn't about punishing them. It was about reclaiming something I had been denied. And still, the thought lingered. Maybe I wanted them to feel the sting. Just once. Just enough to know what it was like to be left out of a story that was supposed to include you. On the 20th of December, I drove to Aspen again. The roads lined with evergreens bent heavy under the weight of snow. The mountains rose like watchmen against the sky, their peaks shrouded in mist. The closer I came to the lodge, the more I felt the strange mix of triumph and vulnerability. Inside, the place was ready. Firewood stacked high beside the hearth, candles placed along the dining table, stockings hanging above the mantel. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine, even though the ovens were still cold. Every detail seemed to hum with promise. But the silence in the rooms echoed louder than any laughter that would soon fill them. I walked through each space slowly, running my hands along the banisters, adjusting pillows that were already straight. It was as though preparing the house was also preparing myself, smoothing edges, setting boundaries, declaring that this time I would not be invisible. Yet, even as I admired the glow of the tree lights against the windows, I couldn't help but feel the ache beneath the pride. A part of me, small but stubborn, still wanted my parents to call. Still wanted to hear my mother's voice asking where I'd be for Christmas, even if the question came too late. But the phone remained silent, and with each passing day, I understood more clearly. That silence was the truth I had been running from my entire life. When I finally returned to Denver, snow clung to the hem of my coat, melting in drops that stained the floor. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time, daring it to light up with their names. It didn't. In that silence, I found my answer. This wasn't about waiting for them anymore. It wasn't about hoping for scraps of inclusion. It was about building something that couldn't be taken away, no matter how carefully they curated their own holiday. The storm was coming, not the snow, but the reckoning. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. The morning of December 23rd began with a silence so pure it almost felt sacred. The mountains stood shrouded in pale mist, their peaks glowing faintly as the winter sun began to rise. Inside the lodge, every detail had already been prepared. Fires were stacked and waiting to be lit, garlands curled along the stairwell, and the long dining table gleamed with polished glasses and gold-rimmed plates. For weeks I had imagined this moment, and now it was finally here. By noon, the quiet was broken by the sound of tires crunching over snow. I moved to the window just in time to see the first shuttle crest the drive, headlights cutting through the pale light. My heart thudded hard, faster than I expected. This was it. No more rehearsing, no more imagining. The family I had chosen was about to walk through my doors. Aunt Sarah stepped out first, bundled in a heavy coat, her eyes widening as she looked up at the lodge. For a moment she just stood there, her breath forming little clouds in the cold air. Then she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that erased decades in a heartbeat. Behind her came Uncle James, leaning into the wind, and then my cousin Mark, who carried his bag like it weighed nothing. Their voices rose in laughter as they took in the sight, and the sound filled me with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fires waiting inside. I opened the door before they could knock, the heat of the lodge spilling out into the snow. "Welcome home," I said, though my voice trembled slightly. It wasn't just a greeting. It was a declaration. The moment they stepped inside, their reactions told me everything I needed to know. Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears as she ran her hand along the banister, whispering that it felt like stepping into a Christmas movie. Mark let out a low whistle, his gaze sweeping over the towering tree in the great room. James settled into a chair near the fire almost immediately, sighing as though the tension of the entire year had been lifted from his shoulders. And just like that, the house was alive. Their voices echoed against the beams, laughter rolling from room to room. Sarah found her welcome basket upstairs and returned holding the socks I'd chosen for her, insisting she'd wear them immediately. Mark poked his head into the kitchen, asking what was for dinner, already comfortable enough to tease. As more shuttles arrived, the energy grew richer. Each knock at the door was another wave of life spilling into the space. Bags piled up in the entryway, coats hung dripping by the door, and conversations began to overlap like layers of music. Someone called the view from the balcony the best they'd ever seen, and someone else said they could smell the cinnamon rolls before they'd even stepped out of the car. By evening, the lodge had transformed completely. The fire roared in the hearth, drinks clinked softly in hands, and music floated under the sound of voices. I stood back for a moment watching them all. Family gathered not out of obligation, but because they wanted to be here. And somewhere, not too far away, my parents were setting their own table, counting chairs that would stay empty. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the forgotten one. I felt like the host, the center, the heartbeat of something real. Christmas Eve dawned with a pale sky stretched thin over the mountains, the kind of cold light that made the snow sparkle like glass. Inside the lodge, the air was anything but quiet. Laughter rose from the kitchen as cousins argued about cookie recipes. The fire cracked in the great room, and the smell of cinnamon and butter drifted through every hall. It was everything I had dreamed of. Warmth, chaos, and a sense of belonging so thick it seemed to wrap itself around me like a blanket. But beneath it all, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. It began in the early hours, just as the first guests wandered down for coffee. A call from my mother. I let it ring. Another from my father, immediately after. I slid the phone into my pocket, determined not to let the sound of their names poison the morning. Yet the calls kept coming, each one sharper than the last. By mid-morning, texts began to follow. The first message was short, clipped. "Where are you spending Christmas?" The second, from Michael, carried the edge of frustration. "Did you invite everyone to Aspen?" By the time the third came through, my mother's voice had found its way into her words. Long sentences without punctuation, spilling accusations across the screen. "You have manipulated the family. You have stolen Christmas. Do you know how embarrassing this is?" I stared at the messages for a long time, the sound of laughter echoing just beyond the kitchen walls. For a moment, I almost replied. Almost slipped back into the familiar pattern of defending, explaining, trying to justify myself to people who had never once tried to understand me. But I didn't. Not this time. Instead, I silenced the phone and tucked it away in a drawer upstairs. Let them sit with the silence. Let the empty chairs at their table speak louder than any words I could send. Back downstairs, the house carried on without interruption. Mark challenged my uncle to a game of cards. Sarah hummed carols under her breath as she knit by the fire. The chef's preparations filled the air with the smell of rosemary and garlic. It was impossible to ignore how different it felt. Unforced, genuine, free from the constant weight of judgment I had grown up with. Still, every now and then, I caught myself glancing toward the office, as though the phone's muffled vibrations could still seep through the walls. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was habit. Years of training to anticipate their disappointment, to soften the blow before it ever landed. But now, there was no softening left to give. As evening fell, the lodge glowed against the snow. Candles flickered on the dining table, casting warm halos across plates already set for the feast. My guests gathered in the great room, voices weaving together in the kind of sound I had once only dreamed of. Outside, snow fell in slow, lazy flakes, sealing us in a cocoon of light and laughter. And somewhere else, my parents sat at their own table, their silence shattered by the absence of nearly everyone they had expected. The balance had shifted, and for the first time, I wasn't the one left out. Christmas morning in Aspen looked like something out of a painting. The sun rose golden over the mountains, spilling light across the untouched snow, while inside the lodge, stockings hung heavy with gifts, and the tree lights glowed softly. My cousin's laughter carried through the halls as wrapping paper tore and mugs of hot cocoa steamed in their hands. It should have been perfect, and in many ways it was. But even in the warmth of that moment, I couldn't escape the vibration of my phone upstairs. By now, there were over a dozen missed calls. Michael had texted again, his words clipped with impatience. "This is petty. You've made your point. Call Mom and Dad." I stared at the message for a long time before finally deciding to answer. Not because I wanted to, but because I was ready. For once, the timing would be mine. I slipped away to the upstairs office, closing the door behind me. The noise of the house dimmed, leaving only the hum of my breath as I scrolled to my mother's name and pressed call. She picked up before the first ring ended. Her voice was sharp, brittle with anger. She didn't wish me a Merry Christmas. She didn't ask how I was. She demanded to know why half the family had abandoned their holiday to be with me. Her words came fast, stolen, manipulated, betrayed. It was as though she had rehearsed them, building the case against me in her head before she even answered. I let her talk. Years of conditioning had trained me to defend myself immediately, to fill the silence with explanations she never wanted to hear. But this time, I stayed quiet. And in that silence, she revealed more than she intended. She wasn't really angry about my invitation. She was angry about the loss of control. When she finally paused, I spoke slowly, evenly. I told her I had invited the family because I wanted to spend Christmas with people who wanted me there. I hadn't forced anyone to come. They chose. Her voice wavered then, shifting from anger to disbelief. She asked why I would go out of my way to disrupt their holiday. And there it was. The assumption that their Christmas was the default. That my decision to create something different was sabotage rather than independence. I reminded her gently that I had never been invited to her version of immediate family, that this exclusion was not new, only clearer this year. She tried to backtrack, claiming it wasn't personal, that I had misunderstood. But the words rang hollow. After decades of being the optional guest, I knew exactly what immediate family had always meant. At that point, my father's voice cut in, calm but cold. He said the whole situation was blown out of proportion, that families shouldn't keep score. The irony nearly made me laugh. They had been keeping score my entire life, counting my failures, minimizing my successes, measuring me against Michael and finding me lacking. I told them, with as much steadiness as I could, that I wasn't going to argue, that I hoped they enjoyed their day, but I would not apologize for building my own. Before they could reply, I ended the call. For a moment, the silence pressed heavy in the office. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the release of something I'd been holding on to for far too long. Then, slowly, I walked back downstairs. The lodge was alive with sound. Cousins playing cards, Sarah humming by the fire, the chef moving quietly in the kitchen. No one asked about the call, and I didn't offer. The truth of it was mine to carry, and I chose not to let it poison the space I had created. That night, as the family gathered around the long table, the candles flickering against smiling faces, I felt the weight of a shift I couldn't undo. My parents' house would never feel like home, but this one, filled with laughter, light, and the people who chose me, already did. The day after Christmas arrived soft and quiet, as though the mountains themselves had exhaled. The snow outside the lodge lay untouched, glittering under the pale sky. Inside, the echoes of the holiday lingered in every corner. Wrapping paper scraps still clung to the carpet near the tree. Mugs with half-finished cocoa rested on side tables, and quilts were tossed across chairs where laughter had carried late into the night. I padded through the great room barefoot, gathering stray ribbons and folding blankets. The house felt full, even in its quiet, as if the joy of the past 2 days had soaked into the walls. This, I realized, was the kind of Christmas I had always wanted. Not perfect, not polished, but real. Guests drifted in slowly, rubbing sleep from their eyes and clutching warm cups of coffee. Conversations were softer now, no longer buzzing with excitement but settling into the gentle rhythm of memory-making. Sarah pulled me into a long hug, whispering that this had been the best Christmas she'd had in decades. Mark teased that I'd set the bar too high for anyone else in the family to compete. Even James, a man of few words, told me that the lodge felt like it belonged to all of us. By midday, the shuttles began arriving. Suitcases lined the entryway, coats were slipped on, and the air filled with goodbyes that lingered longer than usual. Each hug carried the weight of what we had shared, a silent understanding that this holiday had been different, a small rebellion that had shifted the center of gravity in ways none of us could ignore. When the last shuttle disappeared down the snow-covered drive, I stood on the porch for a long while, watching the taillights fade into the distance. The silence that followed was not the heavy silence of exclusion I had known in my parents' house. It was lighter, filled with release. Inside, the lodge seemed enormous without the people who had filled it. Every room echoed again, but the emptiness didn't sting. Instead, it reminded me of what had just happened. Proof that I could create something of my own. Proof that family could mean more than a title or bloodline. I made myself tea and sat by the window, watching the snow fall in slow sheets. My phone sat on the table beside me, dark and quiet. I knew messages were waiting. My parents wouldn't let the silence rest forever. They would find new words to dress their anger, to reframe themselves as the wounded ones. But for the first time, I didn't feel the need to check. When I finally turned it on, the flood of messages came quickly. Short, clipped notes from my father, long paragraphs from my mother, twisting the story, trying to understand why I would do something so cruel. Yet even as I read them, I felt a calm I had never known before. Their words no longer dictated my worth. I typed a simple reply. I had a wonderful Christmas. I hope you did too. Nothing more. No explanation, no defense, no apology. Just the truth. As evening fell, I walked through the lodge slowly, dimming the lights, letting the fire burn low. The place no longer felt like just a property, or even just a retreat. It was a symbol, a marker of the life I had built on my own terms. I thought of the girl I used to be, sitting quietly at my parents' table, hoping to be noticed, rehearsing conversations in the car on the way over. That girl had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who no longer asked for permission to belong. The holidays would never be the same after this. My parents would cling to their narrative, painting me as the one who fractured the family. But I knew the truth. The fracture had been there all along. I had only chosen to stop standing on the broken edge. This year, I had written my own chapter, and no matter how my parents told the story, that chapter was mine to keep. The days after Christmas passed slowly, as though the world itself needed time to recover from the storm. Aspen remained wrapped in snow, the sky a shifting canvas of grays and blues, and the lodge settled into a quiet that no longer felt hollow. It was the kind of silence that comes after a song, lingering, gentle, a reminder of what had just been played. I stayed for a few more days after the family left. Each morning I walked the trails that curved behind the lodge, boots sinking into powder, the air sharp enough to sting my lungs. The solitude wasn't heavy anymore. It was grounding. With each step, I thought about what had happened, not just the holiday itself, but the years of exclusion that had led to it. For so long, I had believed that family was something fixed, unchangeable, dictated entirely by blood and tradition. But watching my aunts and cousins gather in my lodge, hearing their laughter echo through walls I had built for myself, I realized something I had never allowed myself to fully believe. Family could be chosen. It could be shaped by love, by presence, by people who wanted to be there without obligation. That realization didn't erase the ache of what I had missed. It didn't undo the years of being the overlooked daughter, the quiet sibling pushed out of the frame, but it reframed it. My parents' rejection no longer defined me, my response to it did. The phone didn't stay silent for long. Over the next days, messages trickled in not only from my parents, but from relatives who had split their loyalties. Some wanted to keep the peace, gently suggesting that I reach out or smooth things over. Others confessed that my parents were furious, accusing me of stealing the family away. In the past, those words would have cut me deeply. Now they felt distant, almost hollow, because the truth was clear. I hadn't stolen anyone. I had simply opened a door and people had walked through it willingly. One evening, sitting by the fire with a book in my lap, I caught myself wondering what next year would look like. Would Sarah and Mark come back to Aspen? Would others follow? Would my parents try harder to hold on to the relatives who had chosen me this time? The uncertainty used to terrify me. Now it felt like possibility. For the first time, the holidays weren't a performance I had to attend in order to prove my worth. They were mine to shape. I thought often about my sister. Not the literal one in this story, but the metaphorical one my parents had always set me against. The perfect child, the chosen one, the golden sibling who had never seemed to stumble. My life had been measured against hers for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand on my own terms. This Christmas had broken that comparison wide open. I wasn't a shadow anymore. I wasn't waiting for approval that would never come. Instead, I was building something new. On my last night in Aspen, I turned off all the lights except for the tree in the great room. I sat in the glow of its ornaments and thought about the little girl I used to be, the one who wore the green dress sewn by her grandmother, the one nudged out of the family photo so the real trio could pose together. That girl had carried her hurt for decades, but now, I wanted her to know that she hadn't been forgotten. She had grown into someone strong enough to build her own table, her own gathering, her own home. As the fire crackled and the snow fell quietly outside, I whispered it aloud, as if she could hear me. You belong. You always did. The lodge would be quiet again in the morning, but it would never be empty. Not anymore. The drive back to Denver was long and quiet, the kind of silence that gave me too much time to think. Snow flurries streaked across the windshield as the mountains receded in the rearview mirror, and I couldn't help but feel that I was leaving something behind. But it wasn't loss. It was weight. For years, the holidays had been heavy, full of expectation, disappointment, and the silent pressure of wanting to belong to people who never made room for me. This year, I had carried that weight into Aspen, and in the process of setting a new table, I had laid it down. Back in my apartment, the rhythm of ordinary life picked up quickly. Work emails, grocery lists, laundry waiting by the washer. Yet even in the most mundane tasks, something felt different. I wasn't moving through the world trying to earn a place anymore. I had taken one. That shift was subtle, but powerful. I knew my parents would tell their version of the story for months, maybe years. They would talk about betrayal, about disrespect, about how I had stolen the family. They would cast themselves as the wronged party, and maybe some people would believe them. But I didn't need to correct it anymore. Their narrative didn't define me, because I had lived a truth no rumor could erase. When I thought back to the lodge, the firelight on my aunt's face, the way my cousin's laughter echoed against the beams, the sight of snow falling while stockings bulged with gifts, I realized something that startled me. For the first time, I wasn't jealous of anyone else's family. I wasn't looking at photos online or stories in movies and wishing mine could look like that. I had lived it. Maybe not with the people who should have given it, but with the ones who chose to. And that made it even more valuable. In the weeks that followed, I spoke to some relatives about what had happened. Some admitted they had seen my parents' favoritism for years, but hadn't known how to intervene. Others confessed they felt relieved to have a holiday without the constant tension that always hung in the Hart house. The unspoken truth was that I hadn't just built a new tradition for myself, I had given others an escape too. But the biggest change wasn't in them. It was in me. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come. I stopped rehearsing imaginary conversations where my parents finally acknowledged their choices. I stopped thinking of myself as the forgotten daughter. Instead, I became the woman who had carved out her own place, who had turned rejection into resilience, who had rewritten the script of what family could be. That doesn't mean it was painless. There were nights I lay awake, wondering if I had gone too far, wondering if I had severed ties that could never be mended. But each time the doubts rose, I reminded myself, I had given my parents decades of chances to see me, and they had looked past me every time. Choosing myself once did not make me cruel. It made me free. And freedom, I learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it looks like quiet mornings with coffee in your own kitchen, unbothered by what anyone else thinks. Sometimes it looks like building a holiday from scratch and watching people walk into it with joy. Sometimes it looks like knowing, finally, that you do not need to be chosen to be whole. So as the year turned and the snow in Aspen melted into spring streams, I carried that freedom with me. Not as a rebellion, but as a new beginning. I can't rewrite the past. I can't change the years I spent as the afterthought. But I can choose how the story continues. And this time, it will be written on my terms.